Welcome back to Fast Market here on the TD Ameritrade Network. Let's bring in our next guest for our cash tag segment, and that's going to be Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday is right. Megan, so we're talking big tech today. We're talking Nvidia. It's up 114% so far this year. The optimism in this stock is just off the charts. Market cap on this company has moved up over $410 billion so far this year. Does your data back up all the hype around AI and Nvidia?
Yeah, so whenever we look at NVIDIA, this is really a best-of-breed company. And I think that this is one that we've talked to you guys with a couple of times over the last couple of months and said, you know, the thing that we're really watching with NVIDIA and what I think the market is really starting to key into is that growth potential. And a lot of this is driven by these major, consumer macro trends. So when we break out kind of the consumer macro trends that are driving this hype in NVIDIA, you've got things like AI, you've got autonomous driving, you've got cloud data centers, you've got gaming and even blockchain technology, and NVIDIA has a hand in all of these sectors, but I think that the majority of the hype is being driven by this new AI technologies and how NVIDIA is involved here. And a lot of the large language models that are used to train AI systems like ChatGPT, like Bing's AI bot, they're run on GPU software from NVIDIA. So this is a really good space for NVIDIA to be in, and I think that's where a lot of this optimism is coming from. At least from our data, we're really listening to those consumers who are talking about NVIDIA. So the majority of our mentions are actually driven more from its gaming segment. And so you can see that generic gaming, we do still see a drag here overall in terms of this macro trend. Consumers are talking about gaming even a little bit less than they were last year. But when we look at NVIDIA specifically, we see a lot of traction in its GeForce brand. And a lot of this is from its 4060 series family. I think that those GPUs are set to be released maybe next week, at the end of the month at least. I know it's in May, and we're seeing a lot of chatter start to rise around that. So whenever we look at NVIDIA mention volume, we actually see that rising, and we look at demand and purchase intent, consumers who are talking about getting their hands on that technology. We do see that those purchase intent mentions up by about 17% year over year. So I think it's important to note that when you look at this chart, when you look at our data is going to lean heavily into that gaming segment. So it's interesting that we're starting to see maybe some signs of traction here whenever we see demand growth like that. I don't think that it matches the massive run in the stock that we've seen. So whenever we look at a name like NVIDIA, right now our scores are coming out pretty neutral, but I think that the reason they're neutral is because of those macro trends that we're factoring into this scoring, and because of the growth potential that we're seeing here that investors are expecting NVIDIA to capitalize on.
Hello, Megan. Happy Friday. I'm thinking about changing my name to Kevin A.I. Hanks just because I think it's going to help me in some way. I'm not even sure how. But, Megan, I think that NVIDIA is an incredibly popular stock. I just don't know if it's this popular, right? I mean, I don't know on the hype that AI is promising, because let's face it, their earnings last quarter were better, but not great. Their PC demand is still down and not bottoming out yet. We have the valuation. I don't know. 180 PE seems a bit rich for me on any single level that I would think of. But your data, where all our opinions meet your data, Megan, is in the divergence in the consumer price or the consumer purchase intent. That rise in the stock is not followed by the rise in purchase intent. And this is when LikeFolio's data, I think, becomes really important, because you're highlighting the divergence between those two numbers. Am I wrong there?
No, you're right. I think that whenever you look at that chart, a divergence is definitely present whenever we see the stock heading one direction. And purchase intent, although it's heading in the same direction, it's not at that meteoric pace that we're registering the change in stock price. But I think that one thing to keep in mind when you look at our data is we're just looking at that gaming sector. And I think it's pretty clear, and even the market knows, that gaming sector is underperforming in relation to its other products, like its data center and like its AI chips. I think that's what's really drove the overperformance performance last quarter that maybe some people weren't expecting. I think it's also important to consider NVIDIA's history. It's been involved in AI or some form of this, high performance computing for decades now. So it's really ahead of the curve, and it's ahead of the curve whenever we compare it versus competitors. When we look at overall mention volume of NVIDIA versus other peers, whether it's AMD, whether it's Intel, NVIDIA mentions comprise about 65% of that volume. So this is the clear leader here, and it's also continuing to gain share. So I think that that's really important to note moving forward. NVIDIA also has a pretty high happiness score. Even though it comprises, a large amount of volume, it's still competitive versus peers with a much smaller amount of volume. So I think that that's important too. And just to consider that, think of how much NVIDIA has grown its data center revenue versus a couple of years ago when it was really much more dependent on things like gaming. So I think if we were looking at NVIDIA as a company and only considering that gaming aspect, then this is completely unjustified and makes zero sense. I think that it makes a little more sense whenever you consider the potential applications on the data side and on the AI side. You can kind of see, where the market's head is at, but agree with you, whenever we look at our signal, if this was an earnings related event coming up soon, our signal would be about a -17, which for us is still in the neutral band, but it's definitely getting into that overbought territory. So I think that there's definitely a case there. But from a long-term perspective, when we look at that long-term signal, ours is a bit more positive. It's still in the neutral territory, the +10, but for us, it tells us that, there is something to this massive, hope that I think a lot of investors are putting in NVIDIA if NVIDIA can capitalize or can execute. And I think that's the key point that you're keying into, that NVIDIA still has a lot to prove, that expectations now are really, really high. And it's more than likely, at least in the near term, that they may have trouble besting those expectations because that bar is so high.
Yeah, I think that's AI in general at this point, Megan. But when you look at that, the different silos of revenue generation that this company has, the advancement as far as innovation goes, I know you got a -17 score on this. They got earnings next week, so we'll continue to watch that. I'm sure we'll talk about it more. But when you look at this, is it from the investor side and from that happiness side, it's like you don't want to miss this boat because the total addressable market for this could be in the trillions.
Right. Yeah, whenever we look at this, we actually have NVIDIA in neutral and at a hold. We actually issue some bullish alerts. We have two, one in September and one we doubled down again in January. That bullish alert from September, whenever we thought NVIDIA was really oversold, we're up about 140% since then. And so this is something where, obviously we liked NVIDIA trading a lot more back then and even back in January than we do right here. But we do still see positive signs of traction. We do see some signs of maybe even potential interest in gaming again for NVIDIA, but I think that valuation is definitely something for investors to consider. Like we said, if we're looking for an entry point, we liked it a lot more a couple of months ago than we do right now, but we're not to the point where we're betting against it.
Right. I bet you a lot of investors would like this to kind of turn down so they could probably get into it at better levels. All right, Megan, great stuff as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right.